You've got this.
Thank you, Tim. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Food and nutrition insecurity is becoming increasingly visible in urban areas of developing countries. But it is at the same time a complex situation characterized by diversity, both in the urban consumer and in the food systems that they access. What we've seen is that urbanization has been a key driver in the modernization of food systems. It's brought about significant changes in marketing and procurement procedures, reductions in unit costs, meeting the increasingly stringent standards of the urban consumer, but it tends to be linked to minority, the middle class living in urban communities. In this presentation, I want to focus in on the urban poor, a significant and growing population, and how that urban poor accesses their food. This population includes the close to 900 million people living in slums in developing countries, a number which is forecast to grow to about 1.5 billion within the next 10 years. This will include 70% of the African urban population. This population is and will remain significantly food insecure. Now, unlike the rural poor who access their food through a combination of own production, in-kind service, for example, Ganyu labor, family or community networks, and cash, the urban poor, their access to food is mediated almost exclusively through cash. And this has significant implications for the way that they access food. Income and employment patterns of the urban poor govern the extent to which they can participate in different market segments, not just because of the price of the food in sort of higher value market segments, but also because of the location of food outlets. Slums don't have many opportunities for accessing food. Income and employment and the situation in which the urban poor live also limits their ability to transform and to store food. They lack the physical space to prepare food. They lack the technology such as refrigeration, access to energy, and to clean water to process food. This means that they tend to be reliant on more processed food when they buy it. And they're dependent on informal food systems to a very large extent. Informal food systems, by their nature, are able to provide small units, often processed food, in a way which is consistent with the low and fragmented, inconsistent income and employment patterns of the rural poor. But at the same time, the characteristics of the informal system are such that the actors, the small traders, the processors, the vendors, are also trying to minimize their own costs to make a little bit of a profit. And in doing this, they minimize transportation and storage. They try to work with their proximity to the consumer. They make low levels of investment, and they try to avoid often very costly regulations. As a result of this, we find that informal systems tend to provide food in ways which is of a lower quality and in less standardized units than those accessed by other populations. Often, food safety is inadequate, and the unit cost to the consumer and also its volatility tends to be much greater. And all of this is put together, and informal food systems tend to be seen as part of the problem and not part of the solution in feeding the urban poor. However, I think this is a misconception, and it's one which is increasingly recognized. Indeed, the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact includes a specific recommendation that we need to acknowledge the informal food sector and its importance, not just in providing food at a reasonable cost to the consumer, but also in providing employment opportunities to the rural poor. So how do we go about this? How do we try to integrate the informal sector, recognizing the problems and limitations that it faces, into urban food systems? There are a number of approaches. These might include inclusive spatial planning. In other words, ensuring that vendors within the informal system are able to access public spaces which are closer to those that they are serving, whether it be where the urban poor is living, or where the urban poor is working. Vendors tend to be mobile, and regulations which allow that mobility may be important. Appropriate regulation is also important. While registering small and medium-sized enterprises may be critical in providing key services, such as improved energy, hygiene practices, to street vendors, for example, at the same time, we don't want to over-restrict their ability to use public spaces. There's a tendency in some municipalities to try to push the urban sector away from public spaces and to over-regulate. In a similar way with food safety considerations, clearly regulation and surveillance is important, but at the same time this can be very costly to urban municipalities. The informal sector is very fragmented, there are very many actors, so how do we actually monitor the practices, the way that they're preparing their food to ensure that food safety regulations are adhered to? And here, self-regulation may be part of a model that we need to look at in terms of regulating the informal sector. And a final component of an integrated informal, integrating the informal sector is to recognize that significant levels of investment in improving those informal food systems are required. But unlike formal food systems where significant private sector investment has been made, the very nature of informal food systems, their fragmented nature, the high risks, the low returns, have meant that private sector has been reluctant to make significant investments. So some level of public investment or public facilitation of investment may be important here. So I want to finish by just providing an example which brings some of these elements together. And this is a project, Safer and Healthier Street Food in Bangladesh, a project implemented by the Food and Agriculture Organization and funded by the government of the Netherlands. Here the recognition is that in Bangladesh, the street food sector is growing very quickly, but in a very unregulated way. And there are significant instances of food contamination and illnesses as a result. So to try to minimize the level of contamination during the preparation of food, the project has provided 500 vendors with new carts. At the same time, they've trained those vendors in good hygiene practices, and importantly, they put in place a monitoring system which is comprised not only of the Khulna City Corporation team, but supported by a group of school children who monitor those street carts which are located outside their schools to ensure that indeed food regulations are being adhered to. And the positive effects of this project have included an increase in consumer confidence, a much lower incidence of food illness, an increase for most vendors of income of over 100%, and also, because we're involving the school children, a mass safety food education scheme, which is critically important in Khulna as in other parts of Bangladesh. And because of the success of that, it's now being extended to other parts of Bangladesh, primarily in Dhaka, where we've just had 600 additional carts provided to vendors. So in summary, I think the key point to leave is that while we certainly need to strengthen food systems in urban areas, we need to do this whilst preserving the critical role that informal food systems are providing, not only in providing food to the poor, but also in providing employment opportunities which allow the poor to generate the income to buy the food that they so desperately need. Thank you.